The wind howled through the pines as Daniel Mitchell stood in his cabin doorway, watching the latest mail order bride climb into the departing wagon. That made 7. 7 women who had taken one look at his remote mountain homestead, endured less than a week of the harsh wilderness life, and fled back to civilization without so much as a goodbye. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground as it disappeared around the bend, leaving him alone once again with nothing but the endless Colorado peaks in his own stubborn pride. Daniel closed the heavy wooden door and leaned against it, running callous hands through his dark hair. At 32, he had built a life of solitude in these mountains, carving out an existence from timber and trapping. But the isolation was wearing on him. Each failed attempt at finding a wife only reinforced what he already knew deep down. No decent woman would choose this life. No woman would choose him. The marriage broker in Denver had assured him that the next candidate would be different. Ruth Gutierrez, as he had written, was a practical woman who understood hardship. She was older than the others, 28, and had been working as a seamstress in a textile mill back east. The broker had mentioned almost as an afterthought that she was of a fuller figure, as if this might somehow make her more suitable for frontier life. Daniel had shrugged at the detail. He cared little for appearances. What he needed was someone who would stay. But as winter deepened and the snow piled higher against his cabin walls, Daniel began to doubt that even this Ruth Gutierrez would be any different from the rest. The mountain demanded everything from those who dared to call it home. It stripped away pretense, comfort, and weakness with equal measure. Most people, he had learned, were not built for such demands. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, carried by the last mail rider before the winter routes became impassable. Ruth would arrive on the December supply wagon, weather permitting. Daniel had spent those weeks preparing, as he always did, cleaning the cabin, stocking extra provisions, and steeling himself for another inevitable disappointment. Now, as he stoked the fire in his stone hearth, Daniel wondered if he should simply stop trying. Maybe some men were meant to live alone. Maybe the mountains had claimed him so completely that there was no room left for another soul. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin walls. Snow began to fall again, thick flakes that would soon make the mountain passes treacherous. If Ruth Gutierrez was coming, she would need to arrive soon, or winter would trap her in the valley below until spring. Daniel settled into his worn leather chair and opened a book. But the words blurred together on the page. His mind kept wandering to the woman who might or might not brave the journey to his mountain home. He tried not to hope. Hope, he had learned, was a luxury he could not afford. The supply wagon arrived on a Tuesday morning, struggling through knee-deep snow and bitter cold that made the horse's breath steam like dragon smoke in the crystalline air. Daniel had been splitting wood when he heard the familiar creak of wheels and jangle of harnesses echoing through the valley. He set down his axe and walked to the edge of his property, watching as the heavily loaded wagon made its slow progress up the winding mountain path. Behind the driver sat a figure bundled in a thick wool coat and woolen scarf, so thoroughly wrapped against the cold that Daniel could make out nothing of the person beneath. This had to be Ruth Gutierrez. As the wagon drew closer, he could see that she was indeed a woman of substantial build, her form filling the wagon seat completely. But there was something in the way she sat straight back despite the jostling ride that suggested a strength the previous brides had lacked. The wagon driver, old Pete Morrison, who had been making supply runs to the mountain homesteads for 15 years, pulled up in front of Daniel's cabin with a grunt of relief. "Got your package here, Mitchell," he called out, gesturing toward his passenger. "Though I'll tell you straight, this was the roughest run I've made all season. Weather's turning mean, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." Ruth Gutierrez climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity, her movements deliberate and sure despite her size. When she turned to face Daniel, he found himself looking into dark eyes that held neither the fear nor the disdain he had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces of her predecessors. Instead, there was an appraising quality to her gaze, as if she were taking measure of both him and the harsh landscape that surrounded them. "Mr. Mitchell," she said simply, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of distant places and long journeys. "I am Ruth Gutierrez. I have come as we arranged." Daniel nodded, suddenly aware of his rough appearance after a morning of hard labor. "Ma'am, welcome to the mountain." He gestured toward her traveling bag, which Pete was already unloading from the wagon. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "I have endured worse," Ruth replied matter-of-factly. She looked around at the towering pines, the snow-covered peaks, and the solid log cabin that would be her new home. "It is beautiful here in its way, harsh but beautiful." Pete Morrison cleared his throat impatiently. "I hate to rush the introductions, folks, but I need to get down the mountain before this weather turns." "Already stayed longer than I should have." He handed Ruth her bag and tipped his hat. "Good luck to you both. I'll be back with supplies come spring, assuming we all make it through the winter." As the wagon disappeared back down the mountain path, Daniel and Ruth stood facing each other in the growing silence. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around their feet, and Daniel realized that, unlike the others, Ruth showed no sign of immediate regret or desire to chase after the departing wagon. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's too cold to stand out here talking." Ruth followed him into the cabin, her steps steady and unhurried. Daniel watched as she took in her new surroundings with the same appraising look she had given him. The cabin was spacious by mountain standards, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a separate bedroom, and a small storage room. Daniel had built it himself over several years, cutting each log and fitting each joint with meticulous care. "You built this yourself," Ruth observed, running her hand along the smooth surface of the dining table. "Yes, ma'am. Took me 3 summers to get it right. It is good work. Solid." She set her bag down and began unwrapping her scarf and coat. "I can see you know how to make things that last." For the first time in months, Daniel felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Ruth Gutierrez had not come to the mountains with illusions. At 28, she had worked in textile mills since she was 14, saving every penny she could spare while supporting her younger siblings after their parents died in a factory fire. She had watched other women marry for love or comfort or social position, but those luxuries had never been available to her. When the mill closed and left her without prospects, the advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like a practical solution to an immediate problem. She had chosen Daniel Mitchell's profile not because of romance or attraction, but because his letter had been honest about the hardships of mountain life. Unlike the other men who had written flowery descriptions of easy living and gentle landscapes, Daniel had been forthright about the isolation, the brutal winters, and the physical demands of frontier existence. Ruth respected honesty, and she had lived through enough hardship to know that she could survive more. What she had not expected was the strange sense of peace that settled over her as she unpacked her few belongings in the small bedroom Daniel had prepared for her. The cabin was warm and well built, with none of the drafts and dampness that had plagued her boarding house rooms in the city. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the pines. After years of living with the constant noise of machinery and crowded tenements, the quiet felt like a gift. Daniel had been awkward but courteous during their first evening together, clearly unused to sharing his space with another person. He had prepared a simple but substantial meal of venison stew and fresh bread, apologizing for the plainness of the fare. Ruth had eaten gratefully, recognizing the care that had gone into the preparation, despite his modest words. "The bread is very good," she had told him, meaning it. "You bake it yourself." "Had to learn," Daniel replied, a faint flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Not much choice up here. You learn to do everything yourself or you do without." "I can bake," Ruth offered, "and sew and preserve food. I can earn my keep, Mr. Mitchell. You need not worry about that." Daniel had looked at her then with an expression she could not quite read. "It's not about earning your keep, Mrs. Gutierrez. It's about surviving up here. The mountain doesn't care how hard you work or how good your intentions are. It'll kill you just the same if you're not careful." Ruth had nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. But she had also heard something else in his voice, a loneliness that matched her own, and a weariness that spoke of too many disappointments. That first week passed quietly, with each of them learning the rhythms of the other's presence. Daniel rose before dawn to tend to his animals and check his trap lines, while Ruth explored the cabin and began to understand the systems he had built for survival. She mended his clothes with neat, precise stitches, reorganized his sparse pantry with an efficiency born of years managing on limited resources, and began planning improvements that would make their shared life more comfortable. Unlike the previous brides, Ruth did not complain about the cold, the isolation, or the primitive conditions. She had lived in worse circumstances and understood that comfort was something you created through work and ingenuity, not something you expected to be handed to you. When the wind howled through the valley at night, she did not huddle in fear, but instead listened to its voice with the attention of someone learning a new language. Daniel began to relax in her presence, his initial weariness giving way to something approaching companionship. He found himself explaining the patterns of weather and wildlife, pointing out the landmarks that helped him navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. Ruth listened with genuine interest, asking practical questions that showed she was thinking about how to contribute rather than simply endure. "The snow will get deeper," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "By January, we might be snowed in for weeks at a time. No way in or out until spring. Then we must be well prepared," Ruth replied calmly. "What do we need to do?" The word we hung in the air between them, and Daniel felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For the first time since she had arrived, he allowed himself to believe that this time might be different. By the end of her second week on the mountain, Ruth had established routines that complemented Daniel's own patterns of survival. She rose early to tend the fire and prepare breakfast, timing her work so that hot food would be ready when Daniel returned from his morning chores. She had taken over the mending and clothing repair, her skilled seamstress fingers, making quick work of tears and worn patches that Daniel had been ignoring for months. More importantly, she had begun to understand the subtle signs that govern life in the wilderness. She learned to read the sky for weather changes, to recognize the tracks of different animals in the snow, and to identify which sounds in the night were normal and which might signal danger. Daniel found himself impressed by her quick grasp of mountain lore and her practical approach to learning skills that could mean the difference between life and death. "You're taking to this better than I expected," he admitted one afternoon as they worked together to split and stack firewood. Ruth wielded the smaller axe with steady competence, her movements economical and effective despite her size. I have always been good at adapting, Ruth replied, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead despite the cold air. When you grow up poor, you learn that survival depends on being useful wherever you find yourself. Daniel nodded, recognizing a kindred spirit in her words. The mountain teaches the same lesson. It doesn't care about your past or your plans. It only cares about what you can do right now today. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of their axes creating a steady counterpoint to the whisper of wind through the pines. Daniel found himself stealing glances at Ruth as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw in the way she approached each task with methodical precision. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that the other mail-order brides had been, but there was something compelling about her steady competence and unflappable demeanor. That evening, as they shared another simple meal by the fire, Ruth surprised him with a question that cut straight to the heart of their situation. "How many came before me?" Daniel paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "C7, he said finally. C7 who couldn't make it through the first week. What frightened them away? Different things. The isolation, the cold, the work." He set down his spoon and looked directly at her. "The fact that I'm not the man they thought they were getting." Ruth considered this for a moment. What kind of man did they think you were? Someone who would take them to town for social visits. Someone who would make their lives easier instead of harder. Someone who looked better on paper than in person. Daniel's voice carried the weight of repeated rejection. Someone who wasn't quite so rough around the edges. "And what kind of man are you really?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they had shared since her arrival. Daniel found himself struggling for words, unused to such direct examination of his character. "I'm a man who chose this life because it suits me," he said slowly. "I work hard. I keep my word, and I don't ask for more than I'm willing to give. But I'm not easy to live with. And this place," he gestured toward the window where snow was beginning to fall again. "This place demands everything you have. It doesn't leave room for pretense or weakness." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "I did not come here seeking an easy life, Mr. Mitchell. I came seeking an honest one. If you can offer that, then perhaps we can make something worthwhile together." Daniel felt that tight knot in his chest loosen another degree. "I can offer honest," he said. "It's about the only thing I have in abundance." "Then we understand each other," Ruth replied, and returned to her meal with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. The third week brought the first serious test of Ruth's resolve. A blizzard swept down from the high peaks with little warning, transforming the mountain landscape into a howling white void that lasted for 3 days. The wind drove snow against the cabin walls with such force that Daniel had to check the structure repeatedly for damage, while the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes of being brought inside. Daniel had weathered such storms alone many times, but having another person in the cabin changed the dynamics entirely. The space that had seemed adequate for one felt cramped with two, and the constant presence of another human being tested his long-cultivated habits of solitude. He found himself hyper-aware of every sound Ruth made, every movement, every breath. But if Ruth felt similarly constrained, she gave no sign of it. She occupied herself with quiet activities, mending clothes by lamplight, organizing supplies, and preparing meals that stretched their provisions without complaint. When the wind grew so loud that conversation became difficult, she simply accepted the silence, neither demanding entertainment nor showing signs of the restless anxiety that had driven previous brides to distraction. On the second day of the storm, when the cabin's walls groaned under the assault of the wind, and snow began to drift against the windows, Daniel noticed Ruth watching him with a thoughtful expression, "You're worried about something," she observed. Daniel paused in his pacing and looked at her in surprise. He had thought he was hiding his concerns. "Well, the north wall," he admitted. "There's a weak spot where the log settled last spring. If the wind keeps up like this, it could be a problem." "Show me," Ruth said simply. Daniel led her to the corner of the cabin where he had been monitoring a slight gap between two logs. The wind was driving snow through the opening, creating a small but persistent draft that could become dangerous if it widened. Ruth examined the problem with the same practical attention she brought to everything else. "We need to pack it with something that will expand when it gets wet," she said. "Do you have any old cloth we can spare?" Together, they worked to seal the gap, Ruth's smaller hands proving more adept at working the makeshift, chinking into the narrow space. As they labored side by side, Daniel found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the warmth of her body in the cold air, the concentration on her face as she worked. "There," Ruth said finally, stepping back to examine their handiwork. "That should hold until the storm passes." "Thank you," Daniel said, meaning it. "I've been managing alone for so long, I sometimes forget that two people can solve problems better than one." Ruth looked at him with those dark, appraising eyes. "Is that why you wanted a wife to have help with problems?" The question caught Daniel off guard with its directness. "Part of it," he admitted, "but not the biggest part." Now, what was the biggest part? Daniel found himself struggling for words again, unused to such intimate conversation. "The quiet," he said finally. "It gets so quiet up here that sometimes you forget what your own voice sounds like. Sometimes you start to wonder if you're still real or if you've just become part of the mountain." Ruth nodded as if she understood completely. In the city, there was always noise, but it was the wrong kind of noise. Machines and crowds and anger. It made you feel invisible, even when you were surrounded by people. She looked around the cabin, listening to the storm outside. "This quiet is different. It has room in it for thoughts and for two people?" Daniel asked. "We will find out," Ruth replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested she believed they would. The storm finally broke on the fourth morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Daniel and Ruth emerged from the cabin to find drifts that reached nearly to the windows, and a landscape so pristine and beautiful that it took their breath away. The sun blazed down from a sky so blue it seemed artificial, and the snow crystals glittered like scattered diamonds across the valley. "My God," Ruth breathed, her words creating puffs of vapor in the frigid air. "I have never seen anything so beautiful." Daniel looked at her instead of the landscape, noting the wonder in her expression, and the way the morning light caught the dark strands of hair that had escaped from her practical bun. "No," he agreed quietly, "neither have I." Christmas came and went with little ceremony, but unexpected warmth. Daniel had never been one for elaborate celebrations, and Ruth seemed content with the simple meal they shared and the small gifts they exchanged. She had sewn him a new shirt from fabric she had brought with her, the stitching so fine and even that it put his rough mending to shame. He had carved her a set of wooden spoons, their handles smooth and perfectly balanced for her smaller hands. "They're beautiful," Ruth said, running her fingers over the polished wood. "You have skilled hands, Mr. Mitchell." "Daniel," he corrected gently. "I think after a month you can call me Daniel." "Daniel," she repeated, as if testing the sound of his name. "And you may call me Ruth if you wish." The formality between them had been gradually dissolving as they learned to share the rhythms of daily life. They had developed an easy partnership in the work of survival, each taking on tasks that suited their abilities without the need for discussion or negotiation. Ruth had proven herself capable of far more than Daniel had initially expected. From helping with the heavier outdoor work to suggesting improvements to his food preservation methods that drew on her experience managing limited resources. But it was the small moments of connection that surprised Daniel most. The way Ruth hummed softly to herself while she worked, filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The way she listened when he talked about the mountain, asking questions that showed she was truly interested in understanding his world. The way she had begun to anticipate his needs, having coffee ready when he came in from the cold, mending clothes before he even noticed they were torn. One evening in early January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Ruth surprised him with a personal revelation that shifted something fundamental in their relationship. "I was married before," she said quietly, her hands busy with a piece of mending. "Very briefly, when I was 19. Daniel looked up from the trap he was repairing, startled by this unexpected confidence. "What happened? He died." Ruth said simply, "Consumption. We had been married only 6 months." She was quiet for a moment, her needle moving in steady rhythm. "I loved him very much, but I learned that love alone is not enough to build a life on. You need compatibility, shared purpose, the ability to work together toward common goals. Is that why you answered my advertisement?" Daniel asked. "Because you thought we might be compatible." Ruth considered the question carefully. "I answered because I thought we might be honest with each other. Everything else we would have to discover. And what have we discovered?" Ruth set down her mending and looked directly at him. "That we work well together. That we do not irritate each other unduly. That we both understand the value of hard work and the importance of keeping one's word." She paused. "And that neither of us expects more from the other than we are prepared to give." Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Those are good foundations," he said. "Yes," Ruth agreed, "they are." Later that night, as Daniel lay in his narrow bed, listening to the wind outside, he found himself thinking about the difference between Ruth and the women who had come before her. The others had been looking for a fantasy, a romantic ideal that bore no resemblance to the reality of mountain life. Ruth had come looking for a partnership, a practical arrangement that could grow into something more substantial given time and mutual respect. For the first time since he had begun seeking a wife, Daniel allowed himself to hope that this arrangement might actually work. February brought new challenges and deeper understanding. The worst of winter was upon them now, with temperatures that dropped so low the sap in the pine trees froze and split the bark with sounds like gunshots. Daniel's trap lines required longer journeys through increasingly treacherous terrain, and there were days when he worried about leaving Ruth alone for the extended periods his work demanded. But Ruth proved herself more than capable of managing the homestead. In his absence, she maintained the fire with careful attention to conserving fuel, prepared meals that stretched their dwindling supplies without sacrificing nutrition, and even took over some of simpler animal care tasks that kept Daniel closer to the cabin. When he returned from a particularly difficult day checking traps in the high country, he would find the cabin warm and welcoming, with hot food waiting in his gear laid out to dry by the fire. "You don't have to wait up for me," he told her one evening after returning well past dark from a journey that had taken him to the far reaches of his territory. "I know," Ruth replied, ladling stew into a bowl for him, "but I worry when you're out so long. The mountain is dangerous, and if something happened to you..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Daniel understood the implication. If something happened to him, Ruth would be stranded alone on the mountain with no way to survive until spring. The thought had occurred to him at well, and it had begun to change the way he approached his work, making him more cautious and systematic in his planning. "I'm teaching you to read the weather signs," Daniel said suddenly, "and how to use the rifle. If we're going to be partners in this life, you need to know how to take care of yourself." Ruth nodded seriously. "I would like that. I do not wish to be a burden or a liability. "You're neither," Daniel assured her, "but the mountain doesn't care about good intentions. It only respects preparation and skill." Over the following weeks, Daniel began Ruth's education in the more dangerous aspects of mountain survival. He taught her to read the subtle signs that predicted avalanche conditions, to recognize the tracks and behavior patterns of the predators that shared their territory, and to handle firearms with the competence that might someday mean the difference between life and death. Ruth approached these lessons with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else. She practiced with the rifle until she could hit targets consistently at the ranges Daniel deemed necessary for self-defense. She learned to identify the weather patterns that preceded the most dangerous storms. And she memorized the landmarks that would guide her to safety if she ever became lost or separated from the cabin. But it was during one of these lessons that their relationship took an unexpected turn towards something deeper and more personal. They had been practicing with the rifle on a clear, cold morning when Ruth suddenly lowered the weapon and turned to face him. "Daniel," she said, her breath creating clouds in the frigid air, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same anxiety that had preceded every previous bride's announcement that she was leaving. "What is it? Are you satisfied with our arrangement as it stands now?" The question was not what Daniel had expected, and he found himself struggling to understand what Ruth was really asking. Satisfied, how Ruth set the rifle aside carefully and looked directly at him. "We have been living as business partners, sharing the work and the responsibilities but maintaining separate lives in most ways. Is that what you want from this marriage, or were you hoping for something more?" Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the cold air. The question touched on feelings and desires he had been carefully avoiding, examining too closely. "What I want doesn't matter much," he said finally. "What matters is what works for both of us." "That is not an answer," Ruth said firmly. "I am asking what you want, not what you think is practical or safe." Daniel looked at her standing there in the snow, her dark eyes serious and patient, waiting for him to find the courage to be honest. In that moment, he realized that Ruth Gutierrez was unlike any woman he had ever known, not just in her ability to survive the hardships of mountain life, but in her willingness to face difficult truths head on. "I want more," he admitted quietly. "I want a real marriage, not just a business arrangement, but I've learned not to expect things I can't earn." Ruth nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "And what would you be willing to do to earn such a marriage?" "Whatever it takes," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Whatever you need from me." Ruth smiled, then the first truly warm smile he had seen from her since her arrival. "Then we understand each other perfectly," she said, "because I want the same thing." Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the melting snow and budding trees. Daniel and Ruth had spent the long winter months growing into a partnership that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. And with the warming weather came the opportunity to build something even stronger. They worked together to repair the winter's damage to the cabin and outbuildings. Ruth's suggestions for improvements proving as valuable as her willing hands. She had ideas for expanding the garden, for better organizing the storage areas, and for modifications that would make the cabin more comfortable and efficient. Daniel found himself looking forward to these projects, not just for their practical benefits, but for the pleasure of working alongside someone who shared his vision for their shared future. "We should add another room," Ruth said one morning as they surveyed the cabin's exterior. "Something that could serve as a workshop for my sewing and your woodworking, and perhaps eventually as a nursery. The casual mention of a nursery sent a jolt of surprise and hope through Daniel's chest. They had grown closer over the winter months, their partnership deepening into something that felt increasingly like a real marriage. But they had not yet spoken explicitly about children or the future they might build together. "You want children?" Daniel asked carefully. Ruth looked at him with that direct gaze he had come to know so well. "I want a family, Daniel, a real family built on partnership and mutual respect and shared purpose. Do you?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "More than I ever let myself admit." They stood together in the morning sunlight, surrounded by the awakening mountain landscape, and Daniel felt something settle into place in his heart that he had not even realized was missing. This was what he had been searching for, without knowing it. Not just a woman who could survive the hardships of mountain life, but a true partner who could help him build something lasting and meaningful. The arrival of the first supply wagon of the season brought news from the outside world and a reminder of how much their lives had changed over the winter months. Pete Morrison climbed down from his wagon seat with a grin and a knowing look that suggested he had expected to find them still together. "Well, I'll be," he said, looking from Daniel to Ruth and back again. "Looks like this one took Mitchell." "About time. She's not going anywhere," Daniel replied, his arms settling naturally around Ruth's shoulders. "We're building something here together." Pete nodded approvingly and began unloading supplies, including several packages and letters that had accumulated over the winter. Among them was a letter from the marriage broker in Denver, inquiring about the success of the arrangement and offering to send additional candidates if needed. Daniel showed the letter to Ruth, who read it with amusement. "I think we should write back and tell him his services are no longer required," she said. "What should we tell him?" Daniel asked. Ruth considered for a moment, then smiled. "Tell him that sometimes the right person is not the one who looks perfect on paper, but the one who is willing to do the work of building a real life together." That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set behind the peaks, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 7 women had come before Ruth, each seeking something different from what mountain life could offer. But Ruth had come seeking exactly what Daniel had to give, an honest partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" Daniel asked as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Ruth leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and completely at home in their mountain sanctuary. "Never," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I belong." Summer brought its own rhythm to their mountain home, with long days of productive work and evenings spent planning for the future they were building together. Ruth's garden flourished under her careful attention, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet and could be preserved for the coming winter. Daniel's trap lines and timber work provided steady income, while Ruth's sewing skills brought in additional money from orders placed through traveling merchants. But it was the deeper changes in their relationship that marked the true success of their partnership. They had grown comfortable with each other in ways that went far beyond the practical necessities of survival. They shared stories of their past lives, dreams for their future, and the small daily observations that created intimacy between two people, learning to trust each other completely. "I never thought I would find peace in such a remote place," Ruth confided one evening as they worked together in her garden. "In the city, I always felt like I was fighting just to survive each day. Here, the work is harder, but the purpose is clearer." Daniel looked up from the row of beans he was weeding, struck by how natural Ruth looked, surrounded by the plants she had coaxed from the mountain soil. "You've changed this place," he said, "made it feel like a real home instead of just a place to survive." "We've changed it," Ruth corrected. "Everything we've built here, we've built together." As summer progressed, their conversations increasingly turned toward the future and the family they hoped to create. Ruth had begun making subtle changes to the cabin that suggested her expectations of permanence, adding touches of beauty and comfort that went beyond mere functionality. She had sewn new curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the porch, and created cozy spaces that invited relaxation and conversation. Daniel found himself making corresponding changes to his own routines and priorities. He spent more time on improvements to their property and less on the solitary pursuits that had once filled his days. He began planning projects that would take years to complete, investments in their shared future that required the kind of long-term thinking he had avoided during his years of solitude. The arrival of their first visitor since spring brought an unexpected test of how far their relationship had progressed. A traveling preacher making his circuit through the mountain communities stopped at their cabin seeking shelter for the night. Over supper, he commented on the obvious contentment and partnership he observed between Daniel and Ruth. "It's rare to see a marriage that looks so well suited," the preacher observed. "You two seem to have found something special up here." "We have," Daniel agreed, reaching across the table to take Ruth's hand. "We've learned that the best marriages are built on friendship and shared purpose, not just romantic feelings." Ruth squeezed his hand in response. "We chose each other carefully," she added, "and we've worked hard to build something that will last." The preacher nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom that many couples never learn. Love is important, but it's not enough by itself. You need compatibility, shared values, and the willingness to put the relationship above individual desires." After the preacher continued on his way, Daniel and Ruth found themselves reflecting on his words and their own journey together. "Do you think we love each other?" Ruth asked as they prepared for bed. Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think we've built something stronger than the kind of love most people talk about," he said. "We've built trust and respect and partnership. The love grew out of that foundation instead of the other way around." "Yes," Ruth agreed. "And that makes it more reliable, doesn't it? More likely to survive the difficulties that life will bring." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had created something solid and dependable, a marriage that could weather storms because it was built on practical foundations rather than fleeting emotions. Autumn arrived with a spectacular display of color that transformed the mountain landscape into something almost too beautiful to believe. Daniel and Ruth worked together to prepare for their second winter as a married couple, their movements coordinated by a full year of shared experience and growing understanding. They had learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, developed systems that maximized their efficiency, and created a home that reflected both of their contributions. The approaching winter held no fears for them now. Their relationship had been tested by the isolation and hardships of mountain life and had emerged stronger and more resilient. They had proven to themselves and each other that they could build something lasting in this remote place, something that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment. "I've been thinking about the women who came before me," Ruth said one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands busy with knitting needles and soft wool yarn. "What do you think made the difference?" Daniel looked up from the leather harness he was mending, considering her question carefully. "They came looking for something that didn't exist," he said finally. "They wanted a fantasy version of frontier life or a fantasy version of me. You came looking for reality, and what reality did I find? And a man who was exactly what he claimed to be. Someone who would work hard, keep his word, and treat you with respect." Someone who needed a partner, not a decoration or a servant. Ruth nodded thoughtfully, and I was looking for exactly that kind of partnership. I had no interest in romance or adventure or being taken care of. I wanted to build something meaningful with someone who shared my values. Do you think the others could have learned to be happy here if they had stayed longer? Ruth shook her head. I don't think so. They were looking for their lives to be made easier, not to take on new challenges. They wanted to be rescued from their circumstances, not to create better circumstances through their own efforts. Daniel understood the distinction she was making. Ruth had come to the mountain not as a refugee from her old life, but as a pioneer ready to build a new one. She had brought skills and determination and realistic expectations, while the others had brought dreams that could never survive contact with reality. I'm grateful they left, Daniel said quietly, because if any of them had stayed, I never would have met you. Ruth looked at him with a warm smile that had become one of his favorite sights. Everything worked out exactly as it should have. She agreed. We found each other when we were both ready for what we could offer. As the first snows of winter began to fall outside their windows, Daniel and Ruth settled into their second winter, together with confidence and contentment. They had built something rare and precious in their mountain home, a marriage based on mutual respect, shared purpose, in the kind of deep compatibility that could weather any storm. The mail-orderer bride who had refused to leave had become the foundation of everything Daniel had dreamed of building in his mountain sanctuary. Together, they had created not just a successful marriage, but a true partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to building something lasting and meaningful. Their love story was not the romantic fairy tale that the previous brides had been seeking. Instead, it was something more valuable and enduring, a practical partnership that had grown into deep affection and unshakable trust. They had proven that the best marriages are not built on passion alone, but on the solid foundation of friendship, compatibility, and shared purpose. As winter settled over their mountain home once again, Daniel and Ruth faced the future with confidence and joy, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them together as true partners in every sense of the word. The second winter passed more quickly than the first, filled with the comfortable rhythms of a well-established partnership and the quiet joy of two people who had found their perfect match. When spring returned to the mountains, it brought with it the confirmation of their deepest hopes. Ruth was expecting their first child. The news filled Daniel with a happiness so profound, it seemed to transform everything around him. The cabin that had once felt like a refuge from the world now felt like the center of a growing universe. The mountains that had once been his solitary domain now seemed like the perfect place to raise a family built on the values of hard work, self-reliance, and mutual respect. "Are you frightened?" Daniel asked Ruth one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks and shades of golden rose. "A little," Ruth admitted, "but not about the important things. I know we can provide for our child, and I know we can teach them what they need to know to thrive in this place. Those are the things that matter." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had built their marriage on practical foundations, and they would raise their children the same way, with love that was expressed through actions rather than words, and security that came from competence rather than wishful thinking. As summer progressed and Ruth's pregnancy advanced, Daniel found himself making plans that stretched years into the future. He began work on the additional room they had discussed, designing it to serve as both workshop and eventual nursery. He expanded his trap lines and timber operations, building the financial foundation that would support their growing family. Most importantly, he began documenting the knowledge and skills that would someday need to be passed on to their children. "We're creating a legacy," Ruth observed one day as she watched Daniel carefully recording information about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the seasonal rhythms that governed life in the mountains. Not just for our children, but for their children as well. This place demands so much knowledge to survive in, Daniel replied. I want to make sure none of it is lost. Ruth smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly. Our children will be lucky to have such a thoughtful father. When the first supply wagon of the season arrived, Pete Morrison took one look at Ruth's expanding figure and broke into a wide grin. Well, I'll be damned, he said cheerfully. Looks like you two have been busy this winter. We're expecting in the fall, Ruth confirmed with quiet pride. That's wonderful news, Pete said sincerely. This mountain needs more families like yours. People who understand what it takes to build something lasting in a place like this. As Pete prepared to continue on his route, he paused to offer some unexpected wisdom. I've been making these runs for 20 years, he said. I've seen a lot of people try to make it in the high country. Most of them fail because they're fighting against the mountain instead of learning to work with it. You two figured out the secret. You became part of the place instead of trying to make it into something it's not. After Pete's wagon disappeared around the bend, Daniel and Ruth stood together in afternoon sunlight, contemplating the truth of his words. They had indeed learned to work with the mountain rather than against it, accepting its challenges and limitations while finding ways to thrive within its constraints. Do you think our child will love this place the way we do? Ruth asked. Daniel looked around at the landscape that had become so much more than just a place to live. It was their home in the deepest sense of the word, the foundation of their family, and the source of their shared purpose. I think they'll love it because they'll grow up understanding it. He said they'll know from the beginning that this is a place where you earn everything you get, where respect comes from competence, and where the most important things in life are the ones you build with your own hands. Ruth nodded, satisfied with his answer. Then we'll raise them right, she said. Simply, as autumn approached and Ruth's delivery time drew near, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 7 mail orderer brides had come to his mountain seeking something they could not find. Each had left disappointed, unable to reconcile their expectations with the reality of frontier life. But Ruth Gutierrez had come seeking exactly what Daniel had to offer, an honest partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. She had not been deterred by his rough edges or the harsh demands of mountain life. Instead, she had embraced both, finding in them the foundation for the kind of marriage she had always wanted, but never dared to hope she might find. Now, as they prepared to welcome their first child into the world, Daniel understood that Ruth's refusal to leave after that first difficult week had been the beginning of everything meaningful in his life. She had seen past the surface challenges to the deeper possibilities, recognizing in their mountain home not just a place of hardship, but a place where two people could build something extraordinary together. The mail-order bride, who had been too obese, too practical, too willing to work hard, had turned out to be exactly the partner Daniel needed. Together, they had created not just a successful marriage, but a true partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to building something lasting and meaningful in one of the most challenging places on earth. Their love story would never be the romantic fairy tale that the previous brides had been seeking. Instead, it was something more valuable and enduring, a practical partnership that had grown into deep affection and unshakable trust, creating the perfect foundation for the family they were about to begin.